Well, they have paid a price. They've lost the Royal Lodge, they've lost their titles, they're pretty humiliated by what's happened. I think they're both in pretty bad mental states as a result of this. There's been a fracturing of the family. I think the daughters are slightly distancing themselves. Clearly, the relationship between Andrew and Sarah has kind of broken down. They're no longer going to be living together. So I think they've paid a pretty big price for this, and I think there will be maybe more to come, more disclosures. Their reputations are in tatters because of their lies about Epstein. I think justice will come. I think there's a real demand amongst the public for them to be held accountable, particularly Andrew. So I do think that charges will be brought against him, not necessarily the sex trafficking ones, but certainly the ones in terms of misconduct in public office. And I think there's a good chance he might go down. People can't fudge this any longer. He's no longer got the protection of the royal family. And there's so many people, even not just the public, but also senior policemen and law officials who are calling for this on both sides of the Atlantic. And there are plenty of charges that could be brought. I think Sarah is a slightly more difficult case. But I do think there's questions about how she's mixed her business and charitable activities. And I think if there was some good research there, that there might well be a case to bring something against her. But I think he's the one that's in everyone's sights. But think how much has happened in just the space of 3 months. So who knows what's going to happen in the next 3 months?
So you've said that you think Andrew might end up in jail there. How do you think this might play out?
Well, I mean, the different scenarios. There is the scenario that it's the sex trafficking and the Metropolitan Police who've been asked to investigate this now for a fourth time, but including by sort of even government officials here. So, and the former head of Royal Security. So if the Met finds some evidence will stick in terms of taking it to CPS, I think there is a chance of a case there. I think there's a case for him to be extradited to the States, which is perfectly possible. They just need to send a warrant to the Home Office here. It needs to go to a magistrate at Westminster, and he just needs to just basically rubber stamp it. It doesn't need a huge amount of evidential material. So I think there is a chance of that. There is a chance the Americans provide information to the British to bring a case. And I think that would be quite popular. I think one doesn't want mob justice, but I think there's no longer can the authorities do nothing, because I think people will be just appalled by that. Then, of course, there's the pressure that's been put on him from the victims' lawyers. I understand even the FBI reopening their investigations. So we've got the FBI looking at him. We've got the Met Police looking at him just on the sex allegations. But then, of course, there's all the misconduct in public office and the leaked email the other day showing that he was trying to obtain information about Virginia, or had information about Virginia, which he was then using a public official to smear her with. That's an offence under misconduct in public office. And so there would be a case to be brought there. There's clearly a lot of testimony in my book about him abusing his position as a trade envoy to line his own pockets. So I think there's gain material there. And people were talking to the National Crime Agency 20 years ago about investigating him. I said, I'll make my material available to them. I've got stuff on him basically taking bribes, which I couldn't put in the book. So I think there are lots and lots of ways in which he could be approached. And I suspect he's going to find in the next few months, he's embroiled in a lot of legal tangles.
And in some ways, your book is a blueprint for multiple investigations that could be held into Andrew. Where would you start? What is the most shocking example of financial corruption in your book, do you think?
Well, I think an obvious area to look at is the relationship with David Rowland, who's never really spoken. But clearly, we do have evidence that, for example, Rowland shared basically loaned money to Andrew, which was then paid off by Rowland's companies, that Andrew shoehorned him into meetings in China for Rowland and his son Jonathan to do business there. We know that a banking license was fast-tracked in the Middle East. So there's a lot of evidence around the Rowlands for a start. I think there's the Salman case, which has never really been looked into. This is the 2022 High Court case between a Turkish millionairess and this man, Salman Turk, a banker who she said had misappropriated funds from her. But in the course of that case, it emerged that £750,000, actually £1.3 million had been paid to the York family, which they weren't able to account for. And that wasn't just to Andrew, but also to Sarah Ferguson and to one of the daughters, Eugenie. And they had very bizarre excuses for this huge sum of a birthday present, a wedding gift, trying to help her get a passport. And that's never really been looked into. And there seems to have been some deal done between the Turkish millionaires and the Yorks to close down the story. There's the activities of Johnny Hon, who was paying the Chinese businessman with close links to the regimes both in North Korea and China, who was paying Sarah huge sums of money each year, supporting her ginger and moss business, etc., which has never really been explained by either of them. So huge errors that have been, looked at by the media. There's a case the BBC wrote about the other day with Pegasus and Alphabet. Pegasus was a solar energy company that Sarah was being paid huge sums to promote. But again, very unclear what they were getting from it, what she was actually doing to promote them. And so I think with the digging in the next few months from the media, lots and lots of things will emerge, quite apart from what may emerge in legal depositions unsealed and also in Epstein papers that are revealed. So I think we've got lots of areas where things may begin to emerge. I'm getting tip-offs from a lot of people. I saw an MI6 person yesterday day before yesterday, who was giving me some of the FBI files on Sarah and Andrew. So the American authorities have been looking at them. There's a whole national security angle that's sort of been ignored, not just the links with the Chinese and Russian spies, but their links with criminal networks, which have links to intelligence agencies. So I think if people really get the bit between the teeth and look into this, because clearly MI6 were monitoring and were aware of their activities, then I think there are lots of charges that could be brought against both of them.
And when we first spoke in August, you mentioned that Andrew had been in business with Hunter Biden, and I think separately with Mark Thatcher in Kazakhstan. Why is Kazakhstan so crucial here? And are there any other countries that pop up regularly in your research regarding Andrew?
Well, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, Libya, China, and Ukraine, I think, are the five. And they're often countries which are run by despots, with those pretty just dictatorship. There isn't any proper media scrutiny. They're very corrupt. And so those are sort of places that I'm afraid people like Hunter Biden and Andrew kind of gravitate towards, and Mark Thatcher. There are opportunities there. You can get on by paying bribes, by getting in with useful contacts. Business doesn't operate in quite the same way. And yeah, there's a lot of stuff that is emerging. As I say, a lot of Hunter Biden stuff was taken out of the original edition of my book, which I hope I can add at some stage. I think there's more research to be done there. But those are the key territories. Very difficult places to research. My researchers in Azerbaijan were warned off. We've got to remember also that one of the attractions, everyone piled into Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan, I don't know, 20 years ago, because it was like the sort of all Wild West. There were huge opportunities and very little regulation, and huge mineral resources, oil and gas. And so lots and lots of companies like British Gas and Shell and others moved in there. Another interesting area which hasn't come up yet is Mongolia, and particularly Rio Tinto, who are operating there, and Andrew seemed to have been involved there as well. So you just get these little snippets from people, and it's quite hard to follow through. People are still pretty nervous about speaking, or I don't want to incriminate themselves. So it's a really difficult area to research.
We talked about Tony Blair, Peter Mandelson, Epstein, and Prince Andrew in the first interview. Can you talk about the more completed picture that we now have after the extraordinary revelations from recent weeks?
Well, certainly about Peter Mandelson, we can talk about. I had quite a lot in the book about Peter Mandelson and his dealings with Epstein, which were financial. And clearly, we've now seen with the Birthday book and the release of that, and indeed led to the resignation of Mandelson, just how close Mandelson was to Epstein. Very similar sort of relationship, like Andrew and Trump talking about him as their best friend. The connections also between Mandelson and Andrew are very interesting. They were the two best men at the marriage of Evelyn de Rothschild and Lynn Forrester. Peter Mandelson was instrumental in getting Andrew the job as a special trade envoy. They're both, as you say, swimming in the same waters in terms of their business interests. And there just seemed to be a crossover with some of the people Andrew's dealing with, particularly in Russia, and some of the people that Mandelson's dealing with. And I suppose the other name we need to throw into this is Bill Clinton, who ostensibly has only had his involvement with Epstein because of Epstein's support for Clinton's foundations and providing jets for Clinton to go and see some of the work he was doing, particularly in Africa. And I'm sure Clinton was a much cleverer operator, and he's not going to get himself compromised by getting caught in honey traps. But clearly Clinton was using Epstein in the way that Epstein was trying to play Clinton. And I think there's clearly more that could come out about that relationship. Mark Thatcher, I'd love to know more about Mark Thatcher. Clearly he was operating in Kazakhstan at a very early stage in the early 1990s. Very similar character to Andrew, protected by his mother, who was seen as a woman of great probity and turned out to have this blind spot over her wayward son. So yeah, we've got a little bit further than when I spoke to you a few months ago, but I think and I hope maybe in a few 4 months when we speak again, there may be more to reveal. But they're just these little tantalizing clues, and it just needs one really good whistleblower or sort of data breach to open up to see what the can of worms is there.
And talking about leaks, there seems to be a strategy behind these leaks about Andrew coming out of America. What do you think the strategy is? What do you think lies behind it?
Well, I think the interesting thing about the leaks is the person who's writing the articles in the papers is Daphne Barak. And Barak is very close to Ghislaine Maxwell. She was the only person to get an interview with Ghislaine in prison. And so I think it's only speculation is that this material is coming from Ghislaine, who took a sort of an insurance policy by collecting this material. And it's her way of helping to get herself a pardon. She's no friend of Sarah Ferguson and maybe has decided to cut loose from Prince Andrew as low-hanging fruit. So that's one theory. The other is the leak comes from the Senate committee, and they are trying to deflect attention from some of the American candidates, particularly people like Trump and maybe Clinton. But it's interesting that there aren't leaks about Mandelson, for example, or indeed Tony Blair, who had connections with Epstein, and Epstein gave money to his foundation, and Blair was very involved in Kazakhstan. So it's an odd one where it's coming from. It's been highly effective. I would say that the two leaks, particularly showing Andrew and Sarah having these contacts with Epstein much later than they admitted, which is something that I talk about in the book, but this is just fresh evidence, has been very damaging. And I think it was that my book kind of softened the area. Then we had all these disclosures from the Mail on Sunday. Then we had Virginia Giuffre's book. And then we had things like the heckling of the king. And that's kind of pushed the whole thing to where we are now, where they've been stripped of their titles and kind of banished from the royal family.
And it's been reported today that Andrew is being quite stubborn about what happens next. He's demanding a significant annual sum. He is demanding a retinue of staff that he thinks is appropriate for somebody of his standing as he sees it. What do we know about what's going on behind the scenes, and what levers do Andrew and Fergie have to pull to get what they want out of the king?
Yeah, I think that's very interesting. It doesn't surprise me. Andrew has been playing hardball. I knew that he was only leaving Royal Lodge because he was being offered large sums of money to go. He's not going easily, and there are a number of other factors. He wants, for example, guarantees for when William comes to the throne that this arrangement will stick. He doesn't want it all to change. There's actually talk of Sarah Ferguson being housed by the king, and in some ways, okay, it's not taxpayers' money, but I think people will feel pretty galled by that. Here she is still basically living off the royal family 30 years after a divorce, in which she was treated perfectly well. But I think that the levers they can pull is the threat to spill some secrets. And though it could be mutually assured destruction in that the royal family have lots of secrets about them that they could spill, there are no beneficiaries for this apart from people like us who'd be able to discuss it, and I could write books about it. So the royal family don't want those secrets coming out. One of the other levers that they have on both the parents is the future of the daughters and whether they're embraced by the royal family or cast out, whether they lose their titles, etc. So there's a lot of hard negotiating going on behind the scenes. It's not all sweetness and light, and it's extraordinary. Andrew, you would think, is in a pretty weak position, but he's playing his cards well, and I don't think William is so as concerned because I think he just kind of thinks and particularly Catherine, I think too, is pretty steely about this. That this is a long-term problem they need to sort out. And it doesn't look good if the royal family are still, in effect, shielding, protecting, paying for Andrew. But I don't think they have much choice, unfortunately. All they can do is kind of hide it so people aren't aware of just how much Andrew is still being basically part of the royal household.
Do you know if anybody in the royal family has read your book?
Yes, no, I know that many of them have read my book, and certainly the household, and actually rather gratifyingly, I was told by one source there that it had been instrumental in the way that they had responded to the crisis and that it had really sort of set the whole chain of events going, which is nice. My book is only part of a broader, I think, of snowballing of what's happened. It touched on clearly a nerve that was already there. But I think because I was able to collect so much information in one point, much of it was had been out there, but I think just everyone seeing it together and seeing it from a figure like me, I think did carry some weight. And it's encouraged a lot of people to come forward and talk to me. And indeed, for the press, I think, to be more emboldened in the way that they look at the royal family now. And we see this also with politicians. There's much more scrutiny there. We've had both Steve Reed, Robert Jenrick, Peter Kyle. These are all two senior government figures and the Shadow Home Secretary, all saying Andrew should, for example, obey this summons by the Senate committee to give evidence. And I think that'll be really interesting because he'd be mad to give evidence because all it would do is incriminate himself, or he'd be found to be lying. But by not doing it, he's sending out a signal that he has a lot to hide. He doesn't really care about the victims. It's embarrassing for the royal family, who've made a big point of supporting victims. So he's between a rock and a hard place there, and it'll be interesting to see how he plays it. He's not by nature someone who is going to tell the truth about his activities. We saw that in the Newsnight interview. We saw how well that went. So I think he would be unwise to talk to them, but I do hope he does.
And can you share some of the most shocking news stories that have been told to you since the book came out?
Well, I don't want to share all of them because I want to have something for the new book, which you very cleverly have christened Untitled. But there is more stuff clearly on his time as a trade envoy. Funnily enough, I was giving at a literary festival yesterday, and I was being rather rude about the former ambassadors to Kazakhstan who had not spoken. And one of the questions was from a former ambassador to Kazakhstan who said he would very happily talk to me now that he had read the book himself. So we're getting people like that. I'm having dinner, for example, with a former equerry this week. I've got a police protection, one of the protection officers I've been talking to. So a lot of really good people are coming forward, and you can imagine the sort of stories each of those sort of three people would have. I'm very keen to clearly get a bit more on the links with Epstein, but also to get more on his financial activities, particularly abroad. I'm getting some new stuff at Pitch at the Palace, for example. I had dinner the other day with someone who was involved in that, which hasn't really been looked at much. But this, of course, is where he set up a charity, Pitch at Palace, which was running events at Buckingham Palace and St. James's Palace to bring entrepreneurs and investors together. But what people didn't realize was that he had set up a separate company, which was a commercial company in which he was taking a 2% skim of any money invested. And it's interesting that in the last couple of weeks, people have noticed that he has been drawing money from Pitch at Palace Global. All the directors have resigned. He's the only person there with his accountant, Arthur Lanchester, who's an accountant who has been, shall we say, investigated by the tax authorities on numerous occasions. He's the accountant for Baroness Mohn, who has been caught to have basically done some pretty dodgy deals during COVID. So he's not a man who carries a great deal of credibility with, shall we say, HMRC. And I think that's, again, odd. Why are members of the royal family using accountants like Arthur Lanchester when they should be absolutely above any sort of they should be dealing with people of the highest integrity and not trying to hide some of their business activities. I think one of the problems is Andrew still is hiding his business activities very, very cleverly, a lot of them on offshore accounts, bank accounts in China. And he's now free to do his own business. He's refusing to share that information with anyone, including his family. You would have thought that Charles, in return for giving him money, would be saying, look, if we give you money, then don't do these things. You don't need to. But I get the impression Andrew is continuing to do them, even with the money from Charles. And in some ways, Charles should be tougher. He should say, well, if you want my money, you need to play by my rules.
Another thing that's been reported recently is that Andrew was quite pleased after 2019 because he could carry on doing his dodgy financial dealings without scrutiny. So I guess it's frustrating, isn't it? Because there doesn't seem to be any notion that he is going to stop doing what he's doing.
No, he says he's an honourable man and he puts country and family first, but he's not. He's continuing to undermine the respect that was held for the royal family because of his money-making activities. And this is why I think there needs to be more parliamentary scrutiny. There needs to be this royal register. He needs to be removed from the exemption he has in the Freedom of Information Act. And so there could be more scrutiny of his activities. And I would like a parliamentary commission into not just the Crown Estate finances and Royal Lodge, but also into his time as a trade envoy. And if the government were to release all the files, I mean, there are tens of thousands of them, on his decade as a trade envoy, I think that would open up whole new areas and probably give us the sort of ammunition needed to bring some sort of charge and conviction.
And I also noticed a couple of weeks ago, which is quite promising in the context of freedom of information requests, is that when a request went in for the lease for the Royal Lodge, it was immediately released, which seems to be a change to previous requests. Do you think that it's going to be easier now to have freedom of information requests granted in the context of Andrew?
Well, I'm hoping so, and I'm just monitoring it at the moment. I can't say I've seen any indication. So, for example, I got the other day, I did get something released. It was a list of people who'd accompanied him on one of his trips, and that's never happened before. But when I got the list, every single name was redacted apart from Prince Andrew. Now, we know even from the court circular that came out at the time who some of the people were on that trip. So that's still a stage backwards from what's actually already in the public domain. So I think they're paying lip service to this. They'll say, oh, well, we released some stuff, but actually they didn't release anything. So I'm not that hopeful. It will need parliamentary pressure to do it. And the sadness is that politicians are much more focused on things like Epstein and the lease at Royal Lodge, rather than the wider and I think more important picture of his finances generally.
And then before we get started on Fergie, just talk about Beatrice and Eugenie at the moment.
Well, it's interesting. Beatrice has been given a new role with Outward Bound. There's a lot of media coverage and indeed social comments in social media saying these poor girls are innocent, don't taint them with the sins of their parents. But I think from my own research, they are very closely linked to the activities of their parents. I think there are some skeletons there. I think it'd be unwise of the royal family to bind them too close without doing a bit more due diligence. And I think in the interests of the daughters, they would be best to kind of go under the radar and give up their titles, concentrate on their careers and their families. The problem is they trade on the fact they're princesses. That's how their business operation works, particularly in places like the Middle East. And we saw Beatrice promoting a Saudi bank only the other day. There are concerns also about Eugenie's charity, the Anti-Slavery Collective. So I'm not sure they will want to give up their titles because that is their cash cow. It may be it needs someone like William to strip them across the board. Anyone who's not a working royal or on the direct line of succession loses their title. And it does seem a very, very antiquated thing. All these sort of supposedly modern young women and men who have got titles who are actually doing absolutely nothing. We've got rid of hereditary peers in the House of Lords. We're getting away from this system of inherited privilege, and yet it remains in our most protected institution, the monarchy.
Can you talk about the ways in which Sarah Ferguson has been trying to get ahead of this story and escape the condemnation that is coming down on her husband?
Yeah, Sarah Ferguson is very clever at playing the press. She's allowed Andrew to take the flak because clearly the Virginia Giuffre book focused everyone's attention on that story. And she's kind of managed to sort of not really get as much, shall we say, criticism or even media coverage as her husband. She's cut herself loose from him. She was meant to be very loyal and the happiest divorced couple ever. And yet suddenly, as soon as he leaves Royal Lodge and loses his title, she no longer wants to be with him. But I think she can see he's damaged goods and it's going to affect her rebranding. She has gone to rebranding experts to see how she can reinvent herself yet again. And whether I think she is very clever. And no doubt in Australia and America, there will be naive people who kind of accept her again as a victim and a survivor. But she is good. She's got a huge PR team who are pushing things. She uses lawyers, as I know from my experience, to enforce a narrative. She's just been caught in a story by a journalist called Michael Gillard talking to a private eye called Jonathan Rees, that how Fergie was trying basically to work with Jonathan Rees to discredit Virginia Giuffre, for example, which she denies. But Jonathan Rees stands by his story. Michael Gillard is very respectable and respected journalist, so I believe them. So just another lie from Fergie. But it just shows actually how sinister she is. This ditzy character is really not the reality. She has very good relations with the Sun newspaper. They've not covered my book. They've never asked me to appear to comment on it on any of their podcasts or asked for me for a quote. So, and they've written a lot of puff pieces about her. We know, and I know from the past, they've cut a piece of things I've said to them about her in return for an interview from her. She has close relationships with a number of other papers, particularly things like Hello. And it's been a good deal. They've got access to her. She's given them stories about other members of the family, I believe. And that relationship seems to be continuing. So she will have her supporters in the press. We think we have an independent press, but there are all sorts of, shall we say, associations and deals that are going on the whole time.